In this video, I'm going to be talking about the characteristics of late medieval and Gothic art, as well as the characteristics of early Renaissance. So, one of the things about late medieval and Gothic art is that it takes a lot of influence from kind of like Byzantine, or we see kind of like this Gothic cathedral influence within the artworks. So, one thing that we notice in the center one is we see those highly decorative kind of architectural elements, such as the pointed arch here, that helps encompass the biblical story that's going on. But as a standard or kind of just general protocol, these artists heavily relied on symmetry. Symmetry is the idea that whatever's on the left is also on the right. And typically, your focus, a lot of times being Mary, was here in the center. So if there were like 5 people on the left, then corresponding on the right, there would also be 5. So symmetry was a big thing. In fact, it kind of looked more like a pattern or a design than it did kind of a natural setting. Okay. Another big characteristic of late medieval and Gothic was the sense that there was no realistic sense of space, meaning the background was relatively flat, meaning there was no like scene, if you will. It oftentimes was just plain. In these cases, it had just this gold background. But the scale, there was no change in the size of the people. So if we look at the artwork in the right, you can see that it almost looks like the figures are stacked on top of one another. They don't get a sense that this person, even though it's higher, is further away than this person here. If you were to take a look at the actual sizes of the figure, they're exactly the same. And that's something that contradicts realistic space. Okay, so there was none. So that's why we say it kind of looks stacked, very tight, compressed. Like they're on top. And then the last one is here. There's an unrealistic sense of anatomy. So if we look at just the figures themselves, a lot of times they look relatively generic, more like symbols than individual people. Their noses and their eyes, well, their noses tend to be elongated, their eyes a little bit too large. Same thing with their limbs, such as the arms or legs. So proportions, they did not really concern themselves with accurate proportions. Okay. If we continue on, because these were kind of like more Gothic, but if we look at some late medieval artwork, and these one, you can start seeing that there is some advancements happening, just a little bit. So if we continue those characteristics, one, the early signs, number 4, early signs of naturalism in figures. So eventually the artists started to step away from this like very flat gold background, and they started to paint a scene, but it was relatively limited. But when we say paint the scene, instead of treating like the figures as symbols, we start having a sense of identity to them. And the artists started thinking about, well, if the story really happened, what would the figures look like, or how would they actually interact in the space? So in this one here, we have a figure where the back is being seen, to show that this person is in front of our Christ figure. And then we even have like some people back here. There's not a lot of size changes or variations, but yet their movement and their body position appears a little bit more natural. The other thing that we see that was not done prior, like in Byzantine, is we were getting the sense of profiles. So here we see the figures in profile, which is a little bit more natural. Okay. And then 2, we're getting a lot more expression and emotion from them as opposed to the earlier Gothic. Last thing here, even though we're painting a scene, we get some architectural elements in a lot of these, or just like, an actual scene like rocks or trees. There wasn't a significant change in the scale. So they had a limited ability to show distance. We understand that, this artist is trying to show that people are receding in space. This is Christ entering Jerusalem. But if you were to break it down, we still get that very compact, stacked kind of figures on top. And there really isn't any size change to them. Same thing with buildings. The buildings typically in realistic space would get smaller, but here they're approximately all the same size. And then perspectively, these angles are not accurate in portraying like if this were, actually him walking across or entering Jerusalem. So they're attempting to show more realism, but at this point, it's still quite limited. So this was like just general characteristics of late medieval and Gothic art. So let's take, and we're going to go a step further into the next century, and let's take a look at how early Renaissance art has taken some of the things that these artists were doing and pursued them a little bit further. So this is early Renaissance art characteristics. The first one is the heightened realism in the backgrounds. Notice that the backgrounds are looking a lot more detailed, a lot more specific, in terms of like their ability to showcase a city or even here mountains and like the architecture over here on the right. You are seeing a lot more fluidity in movement in the figures. They tend to appear a little bit more graceful, a little bit more accurate in terms of their anatomy. And we can definitely see that more just like a fluid motion. They're getting more confident. They don't look so, I want to say, posed or rigid, because we have arms being stretched out, things like that. The other thing here is, even though they're giving more attention to the backgrounds and it looks like there's a larger sense of space, it's still not perfected. Now, similarly, when they used to have the figures stacked on top of one another because they didn't know how to show space, we're still getting that a little bit here, but now it's in the sense of the buildings, where the buildings look like they're literally stacked on top of one another. So the angles of the buildings are not correct, and they're treating the architecture more as a backdrop to what's happening in the foreground, which is where the scene is being played out. So there's a clear separation of foreground to background. As we continue, early Renaissance artists continue developing and perfecting on perspective, and they eventually achieved it. And it's called linear perspective, where linear perspective is the idea that gives that three-dimensional, like we're in an interior space or room. So it kind of tricks the eye, because even though this is a flat painted surface, it gives the illusion that there's space beyond. Okay, there's increased form of naturalism in the figures, seen in the drapery and in the emotions of the figures. A lot more details are being played out. But then also, number 6 says drastic changes in scale to show large amount of distance. So while in late medieval and Gothic, it was very limited and it kind of looked like everything was on top of one another, then in early Renaissance, they started perfecting the idea of space, but it had that stacked feel. Well, by the time towards the end of the early Renaissance, then we're seeing paintings that have a clear difference in size. So we're having very, very tiny things in the background, which helps add to that realism there, and their understanding that when things recede further in space, they get much, much smaller. So I think the big takeaway for early Renaissance is that you're looking for just more heightened details in the realism and natural individual characteristics of the figures, as well as increased illusion of space. So that's a quick overview of the characteristics of both late medieval and Gothic, and then how it differs from early Renaissance, and where really early Renaissance kind of picked it up and took it a step further.